Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Yes, we are surrounded by strong influences, be it horizontal or vertical.
You are right. Since last week, we, as the whole family, were quarantined. We spent the whole week in isolation. So far, none of us are infected, but we hear the news about the increasing number of cases, and also, the changes in the economic conditions. As you said, the strength of the incoming influences is increasing. We will receive these, live accordingly and see where these will lead us. Because the things we can do is limited. We can only protect ourselves and our loved ones.
I think the best thing we can do in such troubling times is to remain centered. If you have a spiritual perspective or if you have knowledge about how the system works as stated in the divine order and the universe, it is possible for you to spend efforts toward freeing yourself from the atmosphere of helplessness. It is always up to us. Nowadays, I spend efforts to see what stays invisible behind the visible things. Yes, I see the events, near and far, happening, but I try to see what is the message of all those events, for me and for all of us. And while I am trying to do this, I revisit the sentences I read in this book, especially at the third part of the book, and I try to see which parts of me are hooked on the world matter.
Because, in the end, we will be shaken or pulled free from what we cling to, or identified within the world matter, both in personal level and in communal events like pandemics, severe hurricanes, earthquakes, etc. So, these times we live in are good for inner contemplation, for acknowledging our strong attachments, for recognizing messages from our body or from the planet saying to us enough is enough. The language of the Mother Earth is harsh. When she tells us that you got what you could get from me, now it is time to leave.
It is similar to the canceration process in our cells. We had discussed this topic in our previous videos. When we don't or cannot invite sufficient number of subliming influences or values to our organism, our body becomes deficient in providing developmentary possibilities to the cell beings. And eventually, to our being. Just like this process, because the scope of the beings widens, the possibilities of the world matter become insufficient, and such severe events you mentioned appear like cancerations. From the perspective of this book, it is good news for the development of the beings, but when seen from out overly attached parts to world matter, it looks troubling, painful, suffering. As you said, whatever we are identified with or addicted to will be suffering as we are leaving these. One of our friends asks, how will we be shaken off the suffering? Well, the best shaker is the events. More we are aware and ready for such events, less they become shocking or painful. By this way, we will pull ourselves out of this clinging. No one else can do this for us. In short, as we widen our comprehension, what we deem as suffering become less suffering. All right, let's continue reading from the page we stopped last week. As for the necessities of evolution, the being once in a while reflects a few parts of the values and acquisitions existing in itself to the brain. And mankind has noticed these influences, again, without properly understanding their disposition, which are reflected from these free parts of their beings to their brains, and has termed them the subconscious. Therefore, consciousness in man is the manifestation of these parts reflected to the body, more correctly, to the magnetic field synthesis constituted by brain cells, through the direct connection made by the being. There is also, as we have said, a superconsciousness field of the being belonging to its unconnected parts that have stayed in a perceptual gathering point outside of the body and are not connected to the magnetic field of the brain, which should be discussed in two parts. One of these is subconscious. This field comprises the parts containing impressions pertaining to the past lives of the being. The second part we call higher consciousness, containing the influences constantly received from its spirit and other beings by the being's part which has stayed free. So, as a result of their relations of consciousness with higher consciousness, relations and exchanges are built between the influences mankind receives from other beings of the spiritual plan and their consciousness. The brain connects to the higher consciousness through the spiritual influences it receives. That is, impressions belonging to the spiritual plan arrive at it via the higher conscious channel.
This passage explains what we call consciousness really is. It explains the specialized functional parts of the consciousness center. Let's take these parts one by one. First, please remember that the energy of our being has two fields of function. One field is the 7/8 of its energy, and this field is projected to our body. And the book gives this a general name as the consciousness center. The second field is the relatively free part of its energies at this perceptual gathering point, and the book gives this a general name as the superconsciousness. We humans name the reflections and values coming from this first field, which is projected to our body and connected to our brain cells, as the consciousness, and in psychology we named its other states as the subconscious and the unconscious, but soon we will see that we need to rename these. The second and relatively free field of our being is not connected to our brain cells, and has two other fields of functions, the higher consciousness and the subconscious. I especially use the term fields of function because we should not consider these as separate parts of our being, like rooms in a house. No, these are within our being, not separately but as fields of specialized functions. We will soon read about more details on these, but in this passage, as an introduction to this complicated topic, the book terms these as parts. So, these subfields of function of the superconsciousness are the higher consciousness and the subconscious. The subconscious is the field where the essential knowledge gleaned from the experiences the being had in the past lives. The essence or the meanings of the all experiences we had in the past lives are stored in the subconscious. And the higher consciousness is like a channel. The influences and values from the spirit or spiritual plans arrives at our being. Of course, we have to use worldly terms to describe this, but remember, it is not a channel.
You are right. These concepts are hard to describe with the worldly terms. You already mentioned, but I want to underline it. We read. And mankind has noticed these influences, again, without properly understanding their disposition, which are reflected from these free parts of their beings to their brains, and has termed them the subconscious. So, this concept of subconscious is different than the same term we humans use in psychology. Actually, Freud and Jung say the unconscious. However, the mainstream psychology uses this term as if this is a part of the consciousness where everything we don't need is swept under. The book points to this mistake, and later we will read more details about the subconscious, about how such a closed system it is, and its function after death. As we read this passage, it becomes obvious that the divine order and the universe gives us a brand new model of consciousness, a new model for human psychology and consciousness. In this sense, I think this is so unique. And we must study this passage closely to understand it very well, because in the further pages we will read topics that will be easier to understand, only if we understand this consciousness model the book provides us with.
Years ago, while studying the book in study groups we formed in our foundation, we had prepared some drawings and figures to explain these fields of function. Yes, our friends may have such figures or drawings as they study this model of consciousness. But please remember that this is only a visual aid, not the real process. Because, these are not parts or compartments. As we read here, the being once in a while reflects a few parts of the values and acquisitions existing in itself to the brain, that is, the magnetic field synthesis of the brain cells. And this happens once in a while, as the necessities of evolution, when a certain situation of the human being in the world makes this necessary. And as the human being gets oriented towards the upper parts of the conscience, it becomes easier to receive such more sublimating influences from the being. And this phrase, influences mankind receives from other beings of the spiritual plan and their consciousness. I think we should not think this spiritual plan as a location for spirits. Because we already read and discussed that for the spirit, having a direct contact with the being and also with the matter is out of question. So, we must remember that all interaction is indirect, via mechanism of influences. So, these influences do not come directly from the spirit. Yes, the book gives here an outline of these fields of the consciousness canter, but in the further pages, it will explain these one by one.
First, the book stated that the being utilized the brain for influencing the consciousness center, and then gave us a ratio. The 7/8 of the being's energy is concentrated or projected to this consciousness center or the brain. But also, the book stated that the free part of the being is not that free. And here, in this passage, we read that this relatively free part of the being is the higher consciousness. Last week, as we replied questions from our friends, we established that this free part of the being is not somewhere else, still in that perceptual gathering point, but this part is occupied with the essence knowledge and impressions the being gleaned from past lifetimes, with the other beings, with the beings in duty with the being, with the influences from disembodied beings, with the influences coming from the plan of duty, etc. I think we can consider this phrase of spiritual plan in this passage covers all of these. Because, starting from the building of the being as a vehicle in service to spirit's evolution until the end of the universe, all those plans and beings in various levels of duty work within such an immense organization. Shall we continue? Therefore, there are innumerable nervous systems which take the influences from the consciousness field, which is the basic center, and consign these to necessary places in order to be used, which are not centers in themselves but stations. And even the influences spreading out to the organism do separate functions. Their source is one and they are always interrelated. Influences come from the superconsciousness and arrive at the field which is directly connected to the magnetic channel of the brain cells of the being. And from there, in accordance with evolutionary necessities, they are sent out to the nervous stations in order to be used in required places for the survival of the body. Therefore, mankind is always facing both the influences they receive from their beings and also the influences they receive from their surroundings. And man lives in the equilibrium of the influences coming from his essence being and the influences he receives from his surroundings in the world.
In this passage, we see that how the projected part of the being, the 7/8 of the being's energy to the consciousness center begin to spread through the body. The influences from the spiritual plan, from the higher consciousness arrive at the consciousness center and from there, are spread out to all parts of the organism via stations of the nervous system. The book clearly states that these are not centers but stations, the secondary centers connected to the brain. Our friends search and watch various animations in YouTube about how such secondary centers work, for example, about the function of visual cortex or auditory cortex of the brain. Let's take the visual function. I look at my laptop screen and receive related vibrations through my retina. The nerves in the visual cortex assess these vibrations passing through my retina and also maybe other secondary centers, or as the book states, other stations that the science didn't discover yet. These stations might be working as transformer stations, as well. Because, when we consider the consciousness center in the body as the most complex and most comprehending molecules, all those influences which are sympathized with these high-level molecules must be filtered down through these stations so they can be in the most suitable level of vibration as they reach to the related parts and organs of the body. That's why, I consider these secondary centers as transformer stations. And in this passage, the book states what we previously read in it with some introductory sentences, that is, we humans receive both the influences from our beings and also the influences from our surroundings. And what we name as world comprehension is the intersection of these. We are always face to face with these influences and live in the equilibrium of those two kinds of influences, and this equilibrium brings out our worldly comprehension.
Recent research done in neurology shows that even if a part of the brain is damaged and removed due to a traumatic accident or illness, many functions related to this removed parts of the brain may continue as if this part is not removed or damaged at all, and the researchers say that those functions are not localized in the physical part but may be working as a hologram. This emphasis of the book, by innumerable nervous systems which are not centers in themselves but stations, makes me think about such research. So, even a part of the brain is removed, the function of this part can be taken over by other stations. Our friends can read interesting cases in David Eagleman's book, especially the one titled Incognito. So, we see that the brain always remains as an enigma, no matter how many discoveries the science makes about it. Yes, these stations work as a hologram because each part has the information or influential structure of the other parts, and after all, the true main center is the being itself. Influences are coming from the being, and also, the unconscious of the being stores all knowledge related to the current lifetime. Soon, we will read more about the very important functions of the unconscious. So, we see the immense organization brought out by the brain cell beings with the centers, stations, and all those instant exchange among them, and the beings governing the whole mechanism of the brain in such a way that even a part is missing, the other parts taking over its functions and allowing the continuity. As we read in this passage, the whole organism works in the direction of finding and restoring the balance, the equilibrium. And we previously read that when this balance is disrupted or disconnection happens regarding the incoming influences, this situation is reflected on the physical or psychological problems occur. Actually, there is no moment for us or any matter of us that is not exposed to influences, but the most important ones are the influences coming from our being, because the equilibrium in our organism is only possible by receiving these two types of influences. Because, when the influences from our being are ceased or blocked, we see the increasing cases of depressions, addictions because our organism begin to work on the earthly craving side, more and more of these. Then, the equilibrium within us is no more. That's why, we need to discover what is blocking what within us so we can continue to be fed and nurtured by the influences from our being. We will be reading more about dreams because our dreams are one of the most important mechanisms for receiving influences from our being. Otherwise, why do we spend 7 or 8 hours of our day in sleep? Our sleep cycle and our dreams have a great function. Alright, now we will read what happens when we die. What happens when the body dies? When death, which mankind calls, again mistakenly, disincarnation occurs, the beings of the brain cells leave their bodies, that is, the brain cells they incarnated into. However, they do not disperse. Because the being that needs to leave the body does not remove its influence over them, even after it leaves its body. With the influences it continues sending to the magnetic fields of these beings, it keeps them together and under its influence in the spatium as well. Naturally, it also receives influences from them. At the initial stages of the spatium, as we will later explain, all influences and connections of a being coming from above, below and the surroundings are severed, except the influences coming from its own spirit. It is only encircled within its own being and the impressions of its subconscious, especially belonging to its last life. And during this time, because it is continuously in relation with the beings of its brain cells, it can collect and make compositions out of the impressions which also exist in those beings, pertaining to the world. This activity, although most often causing much suffering, offers it the possibility to do the required contemplation. After acquiring the necessary results with this contemplation, its awakening and the increase in its comprehension are ensured again by the influences coming from above and the surroundings. Then, it enters a state of ability to understand its true being. Naturally, in the meantime, beings of the brain cells have also evolved of their own accord. By this means, after subjecting it to some very long applications and processes and its completing the preparation for entering the world once again, it is given the right to choose forms and conditions of its life within a field of available possibilities which are most suitable for its evolution in the world. The scope of this field, that is, the field of choices offered to it, depends on the degree of freedom it has acquired in accordance with its comprehension. If its comprehension is too narrow, this field would be very narrow for it, and in some cases, a very limited, almost nil field of choices are left to it. If its comprehension is expanded enough to encompass the whole world, then there remains no need to re-embody and do applications in the world. So, in this way, after it prepares its surroundings in the world in relation to its freedom of choice, it consigns the beings of brain cells which it kept under its influence, by influencing their magnetic fields, to the mother's body, in order for them to build a fetus brain in that mother's womb. And the process we previously explained begins afresh under new conditions. Yes, in this passage, there is such important knowledge.
Of course, this is again an introduction to the topic of death. Here, again, the book underlines that incarnation or disincarnation, as we assume, is not the case. There is nothing entering or exiting the body. What animates our body is the projection of the being, the 7/8 of its influence and energy concentrated on the consciousness center of human brain. And death occurs when the being loosens this concentration, hence, the beings of the brain cells leave their bodies. And this is a value differentiation. However, these beings do not disperse. The being keeps influencing their magnetic fields. They are still under the control of the being. Because there are many impressions in the magnetic fields of these beings related to the worldly lifetime they spent in the body while it was alive. These impressions will be utilized during the Spechium period. Now, please remember that the book previously stated that these brain cell beings are much more developed than the beings in the animal stage. And in our brain, we gather and keep together 100,000 of these beings. And please do not dwell on the numbers, because the brain is such a complex organization that there are levels of management within it, and there are many sub-levels of beings, as well. Here, in this passage, the book mentions the brain cell beings that have functions related to comprehension and the top-level management of the body, and following the death of the body, the being keeps the magnetic fields of those brain cell beings together, and in order to make necessary compositions in the Spechium period from the impressions these cell beings gained in that lifetime. And this Spechium period, well, this is an isolated state for the being. Except the influences coming from its spirit, all other influences cease to arrive at it. The being contemplates the impressions from this last lifetime. And this is not a location we go after death, not a place outside of universe. This is still a state within the hydrogen cosmos. We will read more details about this state.
Yes, the Spechium is not a place we go after death. It is an isolated state the being needs to contemplate, making comparisons, assessing, evaluating the last lifetime. Because, if the being's comprehension and level of development requires another incarnation, or more correctly, building another body in the world, at the end of this Spechium period, the being will utilize the magnetic fields of the brain cell beings it keeps under control for building its next body. After death, the molecules of the body, because the animating influence is ceased, they begin to dissolve, the components of the body return to their basic forms. As the saying goes, for we are dust and to dust we shall return. But the subconscious continues after death. Some questions are coming, and I'd like to say something as a reply. Let's remember what is the unconscious. It is the field of the consciousness at all impressions gained in a lifetime, the field where the knowledge of our current life is accumulated, so consciousness and the unconscious are always there as our body is alive. And when death occurs, all those knowledge and information in the unconscious are pushed down to the subconscious. So, when the body is not alive anymore, all information is pushed down to the subconscious. And the subconscious is a closed system, not accessible all the time. In this sense, after the death of the body, and after all information and knowledge gleaned through that body is pushed down to the subconscious, it is only logical that the being will be closed to all external influences for a period of time. We read in this passage, except the influences coming from its own spirit. The being is only encircled within its own being and the impressions of its subconscious, especially belonging to its last life. And you may know, when a member of our society died, there has sometimes been attempts to contact her or him, to ask about their impressions after death, and in some sessions, it seems like somehow their personality continues in the hereafter. So, we see that an immediate reunion with the essential being doesn't happen. They are subject to some processes after death, and this is the spatium period. And this is such an isolation that, because the being is within itself and its imagination is freed, not bound by the defense mechanisms because the ego is not active in that state, all impressions from that last life are assessed without any justifications, and because the self-deceiving is not possible, the facts involved in all those impressions are relived intensely. That's why the book states, this activity, although most often causing much suffering, offers it the possibility to do the required contemplation. So, the most important point here is this contemplation. Because all those impressions from the last life are also compared with all those experiences and knowledge gained from the other past lifetimes. What was my plan? What did I realize from this plan? Where did I use my conscience, where I didn't? Where was I altruistic and where was not? Where was I aware and where was I unaware? So, this is an accounting, comparing the current books with the previous ones to evaluate the actual progress. And if this contemplation is done properly, besides the points accomplished and completed, the being also comprehends the points that left unfinished, incomplete, or that need to be experienced. Then a new life plan is needed to be outlined and the begins to receive external influences. And the being's involvement in this new life plan is limited with the degree of comprehension it gained. So, the being's involvement in the new life plan depends on its comprehension. We can say that, in the Stone Age or at the early steps into the human stage, because we didn't have that much comprehension, we were not involved in the plans outlined for those lifetimes, so, these were arranged mostly by the beings in duty. However, as our comprehension widens, it becomes more possible for us to be involved in our next life plan with more freedom. We read here, if its comprehension is too narrow, this field would be very narrow for it, and in some cases, a very limited, almost nil field of choices are left to it. Well, this is another reply to questions about the free will or freedom of choice, like how come I chose this disabled body, or why should I choose such abusive parents, etc. Seen from the worldly perspective, such protests we make, but here we read that this field of choices becomes narrow or wide as the result of the processes, such as the being spends in the spatium period and the evaluation done by the beings in duty before outlining the next life plan, and rearranging the system in accordance with the intended outcome.
Within our internal study groups, whenever we discuss the topic of death, and during our conversations about death, we frequently say that a person needs to increase his or her knowledge and comprehension about the processes after death as much as possible, because even a person's becoming aware that he or she is dead takes time. We have many examples of such cases in the sessions done by Mr. Ruhselman and in the literature. And here, in this passage, we see that, this period between lifetimes function as the sleep we have between days. That is, death is not an end or a punishment. If the being withdraws its concentration of influences from a body, we must remember that this is because the needs of the being. This means that it is time for the being to add whatever collected in the unconscious about the worldly impressions to the subconscious, but the former must be processed before they can be added to the latter, that is, to the essential knowledge content in the subconscious. And this process is suffering because the impressions belonging to last lifetime in the world is so clear, and the voice of conscience which was silenced previously is now so loud.
Also, that last life was lived in the superficial time comprehension, but now the being is within the spherical time comprehension. Hence, the time is perceived differently. I remember some examples from the earlier books of Mr. Ruhselman. In a session, a person who died one day ago is contacted and that person says, "I am all alone for ages, I am in the darkness for ages. Yet in the physical world, only one day passed."
Or another example from those sessions about one of the most major life tests and trials in the world. The life plan was about overcoming the murderous acts and thoughts, but that person murdered someone in the last lifetime and now in the spatium. He looks around all the time and searches for the person he murdered, repeating his name over and over. So, in this spatium phase, the conclusions of the being is synthesized by its essential knowledge, but this is not like, let's revise the hard drive C and add the content to hard drive D and destroy the hard drive C. This is not the case. This process, depending on the impressions of that last lifetime, is sometimes joyful, sometimes pleasing, sometimes suffering. This varies in accordance with the being's level of comprehension, the knowledge regarding the hereafter, the level of conscience. And if the being concludes that it does not need to incarnate, it means that the being received all necessary things from the hydrogen realm, because it means that it completed the human stage.
There are many questions coming in, dear Ümit. Let's reply some of these. A friend asks, after death, does the 7/8 of our being unites with the 1/8 of its energy? Does the being spend the spatium phase as its whole energy? Well, we had mentioned that 7/8 part is directed to the consciousness and unconscious, and the 1/8 part is named as the subconscious and the higher consciousness. With the event of death, worldly consciousness diminishes and all the impressions in the unconscious pass to the subconscious. Naturally, these two parts unite, but please remember that these are not completely separate parts, they are fields of functions. The book states that we use such terms to give you an understanding. Actually, there is no such portioning, the being is a whole. So, we must consider this as the cessation of the functions related to the consciousness and the unconscious. And the function of the subconscious increase because all those accounting will be done by comparing the impressions of all other past lifetimes. But later, we read in this passage that the higher consciousness becomes active again as the being starts to receive influences coming from above and the surroundings.
I'd like to thank our friend for this good question. Of course, the being, as in this process of understanding what it missed or achieved in that last lifetime, its energy must be a whole so it can make a proper assessment, especially about the functioning of these concentrated and relatively free parts of its energy ensemble.
Another friend asks, about this contemplation in the spatium, does the process and the duration changes in accordance with the comprehension?
Now, we must remember this: the time comprehension in the spatium is different than the time comprehension in the world. In the spatium, all these processes is done in the spherical time. If our friend remembers, you gave an example about a person who died one day ago, but when a session made to contact him, he says, "I have been here for ages." He perceives the condition he is in as if he has been there for ages. So, please remember that the time perception of the world is different than the time perception of the spatium. About the actual duration, well, of course, if the being's comprehension increased, the process would be shorter than it would be another being, let's say, lived a lifetime full of heinous acts.
Do you remember that movie of Robin Williams? What Dreams May Come was the title. And it was such a good movie about the spatium. And this movie visually expresses how our imagination works as this process continues. How the imagery material of the last lifetime was processed in the spatium. If our friends watch this movie, they can gain many insights. There is a question. When the contemplation begins? Is it when the essential being passed to the spatium? Well, I think we need to summarize what we read so far about the being. Sometimes, we say essential being, but actually, it is the being that built by its spirit as a perceptual point of energies and influences. This point is not a fixed, spatial point. This being builds a body for itself in the hydrogen cosmos. In its current level of development, this body is a human body. Yours or mine, our bodies are built by our beings. And all those stages and processes and exchanges between the being and this body are done by influencing magnetic fields. Our being projects a large amount of its energy to our brain, to brain cells beings to keep our body alive. When death occurs, our being withdraws this energy from our body and the body dissolves. But our being keeps the magnetic field of the brain cell beings under its control. And the spatium period is a duration in spherical time when our being withdraws within itself in that perceptual point. And it contemplates the impressions of the last lifetime its body on earth lived until death. And if our being needs to build another body on earth to complete the missing points and unfinished business that are necessary for its development, then this spatium phase ends. And the being, by utilizing the magnetic field of the brain cells beings it kept under control, our being begins to influence the newly forming brain cells of a fetus on earth to build a new body for itself.
And all those processes are to acquire impressions and experiences in the crude matter of our world, because our being is in the service of its spirit, and that spirit, or I can say, our spirit needs the experience of building and governing our being for its evolutionary needs. Again, all of these exchanges are done by induction, by sending and receiving influences, by influencing magnetic fields of beings and objects. So, there is nothing entering or exiting physical vessels or locations. Our body is here on earth, our being is in that perceptual gathering point. Soon, we will read more details about how the interaction between the being and the spirit. But I'd like to remind our dear friends once again. Watch our previous videos. Topics will be clearer for you.
Another question. How can the being be unaware that it is dead, that it is not alive anymore, despite the fact the consciousness diminished and it is in the spatium? I'd like to give some examples like sudden deaths in car crashes, heart attacks or slow deaths due to hypothermia or smoke inhalation. What happens in such cases? There is no preparation for the incoming death, as in some terminal illnesses. Especially the cases like poisoning, substance overdose, carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide poisoning, etc. Last impressions of the human body is similar to sleeping. The human consciousness cannot discern the difference. And please remember, all impressions of the body and the consciousness are pushed to the subconscious to be processed in the spatium, so these last impressions can cause confusion in the imagery processes in the spatium. And in Anatolian culture, there is saying or good wish, 3 days in bed, in the 4th day grave, meaning that may there be a period for preparing for death. And such preparation may include dreams a person sees himself or herself dead or in the deathbed, say goodbye to loved ones, etc. Mostly, we humans don't think about death. Yes, we fear death and dying, but we don't think about this as a mental and emotional preparation.
There are many examples in the earlier books of Mr. Ruhselman, and if you let me, I can find and share these with our friends next week. Still, in the further pages of the divine order in the universe, we will read about the spatium period in more details.
All right, Ümit promised us more examples to share next week. So, let's continue reading. However, it should never be forgotten that because it is an imperative that all of these deeds should advance in accordance with the divine order, the constant supervision and control of sublime influences and administrative energy complexes which allows these is always present here, as it is everywhere. We would like to point out as well that the beings of brain cells, which are under the influence of the being always governing the man, will not stay connected to it forever. For, They do the necessary preparations for themselves as well, in order to acquire the power to manage a human body a piece independently. And as they complete their preparations, they will separate themselves from the influence of that being one by one and will cease to be a brain cell. For them each to enter the stage of independent human beings, they need to separate from the world and go through applications in some interval milieux outside of the world. Only by this and after reaching a state of ability to manage a human whole, again by influencing the magnetic field synthesis of the brain cells of a man, do they start to render their evolutions, in the world as humans, that is, through the human body. This is also a new knowledge given us with this book.
Yes, there have been many esoteric teachings, channelings, spiritual communiqués giving bits of knowledge about greater scheme of things, but with the disclosure of the divine order and the universe, we now see that most of the information given before were full of holes or confused imagery because the knowledge given was limited. Thankfully, we are now not around such pitfalls. As we read in this passage, there is continuous development for beings, and all processes and mechanisms leading to this development are under the control of sublime influences and administrative energy complexes. Nothing is arbitrary. A being that reached the stage of governing a brain cell continues to get developed, and if it got developed enough, it will separate itself from the influence of a being that governing a human brain, and will cease to be a brain cell. Because, in order to acquire the power to manage a human body independently, it will do the necessary preparations, by separating from the world and going through applications in some interval milieux outside of the world, probably in different planets and different regions of the solar system, until it is ready to enter the stage of humanity, that is, governing a human brain, the magnetic field synthesis of the brain cell beings of a human body. Such a being will probably step into human stage after this cycle ends and the new world cycle begins. Just as we did so far, they will enter this journey of lifetimes in the world, and maybe, towards the end of next cycle, they will come together and talk about the latest developments in spiritual knowledge of that cycle and comment about their future life, just like we do now. And what we read in this passage is so refreshing because it explains what the divine justice really is. There is nothing exclusive to a single being, on the contrary, ever-ascending destinations, milieux, settings or realms are destined for all beings. The possibilities of the whole universe are available and at service for all beings, all spirits. None of the beings are assigned to the level they are in from above, bypassing all previous levels. No, all beings begin this journey from the first step, from the lowest level and continues forward. And as we read in this passage, a brain cell being, after fulfilling its developmentary needs in that level, that is, the level of a brain cell, will separate from the organization it functioned till then, and continue on its journey for fulfilling new developmentary needs.
You know those questions people frequently ask. What is the number of spirits? How come number of living persons exceed the number of deceased persons throughout the history? From where new spirits come? By this knowledge given in this passage, and in further pages, this book replied such questions once and for all. We understand that nothing is fixed in the universe as we generally assume. On the contrary, there is always movement and activity. And each point of this immense universe, the circulations of beings occurs and the possibilities of the hydrogen cosmos are given to them for their developmentary journey. That's why we frequently say that our body is a small universe. Yes, the main center or the main organizer of our body is our being. And our being is connected to its spirit. But there are myriad number of beings that are developing and evolving in systems, in organizations within our body, and each of these beings is connected to their spirits. Therefore, over a single body, an immense number of beings and their spirits continue their development and evolution. We will go into more details as we continue read the book. So, we see that nothing is idle in the universe. Each part of it has a function, and there is a governing or administrating system for each part and each function. And everything exists for the developmentary needs of the beings and the evolutionary needs of the spirits, of which we don't know but try to intuit. Yes, thank you dear friends for your attendance and your questions. Good evening.
Good evening.